This series deals with controversial issues. The following program contains language and images that may not be suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
Dennis Barrie is an internationally distinguished museum director, cultural historian, and an expert in entertainment and popular culture. After receiving his BA and MA from Oberlin College and his PhD in American Cultural History from Wayne State University, Dr. Barrie began his museum career, which included 11 years working with the Smithsonian Institution. From 1983 to 1991, he served as the director of the Cincinnati Contemporary Art Center, the second oldest museum of contemporary art in the United States. During his tenure there, the center was known for its groundbreaking exhibitions and programming. It was also in Cincinnati that Dr. Barrie and the Contemporary Art Center were charged with pandering obscenity and showing minors in a state of nudity. This, of course, is the subject of our session this evening. After leaving Cincinnati, Dr. Barrie served as the founding executive director of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum in Cleveland, where he directed all aspects of a new project, a very successful project, from concept to dedication. The Rock Hall, as it's known, is recognized as one of the most popular museums in the country. In 1996, Dr. Barrie founded Barrie Consulting, a firm that focused on the development of new museums and cultural projects. His clients included the Walt Disney Company, the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum in Nashville, VH1, and the Experience Music Project in Seattle. As president of the Malrite Company, which he joined in 1998, Dr. Barrie has worked on many creative projects associated with museums. The extremely successful International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. was the first the company completed under his leadership. This pioneering integration of popular culture, new technology, and serious history has won numerous awards and had over 2.2 million visitors during its first 3 years. Today, Dr. Barrie is a principal with Barrie Projects and is the director of cultural planning at Westlake, Reed, and Leskosky, a firm that is nationally recognized for its work in cultural and performing arts facilities and has taken a leadership role in planning and designing projects that are remarkable for their innovation and attention to the community. This evening, Dennis Barrie will be reflecting on one of the 20th century's most celebrated museum controversies and its legacy. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dennis Barrie.
I feel like I'm an ex-con when I hear all that, you know. Being indicted, one of the few museum directors. Believe me, museum directors have been indicted over the years, but for many other reasons, not for criminal intent and pandering obscenity. This is like old home week. I had strong Michigan ties. I did work in Detroit for many, many years at the Detroit Institute of Arts, as when I moved from Washington to become Midwest Director of the Archives of American Art, and have many friends here at the university. Now a lot of them retired or gone on to whatever they do after they don't teach anymore. But it's nice to be here, and I'm delighted to be here tonight and delighted to talk about this topic. This is an old topic for me. It was interesting. I have been asked to talk about the Mapplethorpe exhibition and controversy in museums for some time now, maybe about 5 or 6 years. And there was a period in which I talked about it all the time. Maybe it was fresher. It was certainly a passionate part of my own experience. And there seemed to be this great need to talk about what was happening to museums, what was happening to the art world, what was happening in the culture wars of our society. society, certainly in the late 90s and maybe, as I said, up until about a half a dozen years ago. So it's interesting to talk about it again. It's interesting to talk about it and also hear, as Ray just stated, that they couldn't get funding to talk about it again. Again, it goes on and on and on. And I was starting my talk, I was looking at my notes, and I will refer to them now and again, that in the late 80s and early 90s, and some of you were barely born, and a lot of you were very much born then, we did go through a culture war. A culture war that continues to this day. But in the 80s and 90s, that culture war was focused very much on museums and very much on the art world and museums. It was interesting that my little museum, the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati, which by the way has grown and now has a magnificent building by Zaha Hadid and is one of the cornerstones of a very lovely old city, Cincinnati, was the forefront of that battle for almost 2 years. 2 years of that institution's life, 2 years of my life. And when I think back on it, it's actually somewhat hard to think back on it. So some of this is going to be easy tonight, and some of this won't be easy tonight. There will also be some technological challenges, because I realized, I hadn't talked about this in so long, that horror of horrors, I lost my slides. I know that's impossible. I know you all have PowerPoint now, but I couldn't even find my slides to put them on the PowerPoint. And so we're going to have to use a few film clips. One, a documentary done, a docudrama done on the controversy a few years ago by Showtime, and the other, some real footage from the actual events. The interesting thing for me is that it's 16 years ago that this happened. We were, and I will lead up to the whole situation point by point, but it was actually in 1990 that we were indicted for showing, we, meaning the Contemporary Art Center and myself, the director then in Cincinnati, for showing the work of Robert Mapplethorpe. And many of you know his work or should know his work, but it was a monumental moment because, as Ray said, it was the first time a museum and its director were indicted for showing particular work. The culture wars, I think, for the most part, have moved on since that moment. It's interesting for me that I even sensed it as it was happening, that while museums were the focus in the late 80s and 1990s, the people who instigated these wars and who fought these wars and who had agendas in these wars were moving on, as I say, to bigger fish to fry. And our society really does reflect it in these days. We've gone through some amazing times. But again, the battles now tend to be not over museums and their content, but they tend to be over gay marriage, they tend to be over the family values, whatever that is, the teaching of evolution, what's taught in our schools besides evolution, who holds office in our society. And these are the progression of what was happening as early as, well, probably even before then, but when we became conscious of it in the 1980s. And that's not to say that the Mapplethorpe controversy and what happened then doesn't have a lasting impact. It does have a legacy. It still has an impact on the attitudes, the practices, and the funding of our nation's museums today. And as I look at our nation's museums, and I'm a great lover of museums, I spend way too much time in them. My wife and I saw 8 exhibits at the Met on whatever it was, Sunday, and then they had to pull us out. I think they sent in the choppers and got us out of there. But I mean, we still love museums. I love what museums do. I love what they're all about. And yet I look at where these days they have gone. I would say that museums today are as a whole more cautious. I'd say they tend to avoid controversy whenever possible. They're more fragile in their economics, despite the fact that everyone builds one. They're very fragile. Museums could go up, half the museums in this country, that's an exaggeration, but many of the museums in this country could go out of business for lack of support, for lack of audience, for lack of corporate support, for lack of individual support. And they're more susceptible to special interest groups. I don't want this shown, I don't want this shown, I want this shown. It's a very interesting time. As a result, they are compromised over and over again in their content, the content of their exhibitions. They are more PC. PC to the detriment of what they actually want to present to their audiences. They're less provocative. And it's amazing to me that the topics that can't be touched today have moved way on beyond sexuality. In the 80s and 90s, I think it was pretty much focused on sexuality. Mapplethorpe is about a number of issues, but sex is number one. Okay, there are a couple of other things going on there, and we'll talk about that. But it was really about human sexuality, and now it's moved on to all sorts of things that are taboos. Again, evolution, drug use, social issues, ethnic groups, religion. These are all amazingly touchy subjects for our museums. And at the same time, the rest of the society seems to be able to talk about them all the time. I mean, just turn on your television set and you have 300 stations, and you can see or hear or listen to any one of the, a program about any one of these topics. Way more explicit, by the way, than anything that Robert Mapplethorpe did. And in terms of not just the imagery, but also in the content and the conversation. And this is on TV. So it's interesting to see that the conversations have moved elsewhere. And that's not to say that you won't occasionally see a controversial exhibition at a museum, but it's really not where the center of this discussion is anymore. I would say that museums, and art museums in particular, are marginalized, or on the perimeter of all these discussions. And really, the discussions that take place in the museums are for a small number of our society, and most of the society doesn't really pay attention to them. So with that dismal note, we'll tell you how we got there. I titled this section, How Do We Get This Way? Mapplethorpe, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the End of Civilization as We Knew It. All right, let's talk about Mapplethorpe, which is a long time ago for me. The Mapplethorpe exhibition, for those of you who didn't see it or don't know it, was organized in 1988, or at least the version that we ultimately took at the Contemporary Art Center, by the Institute of Contemporary Art at the University of Pennsylvania. Janet Carden was the director and curator. And it was a show that Mapplethorpe at that time was a very exciting figure in the art world. There was a concurrent show at the Whitney Museum, lots of publications. He was well known. And we were very excited to have that exhibition. After it was shown in Philadelphia, it went on to the MCA in Chicago, where at the late 1988, where it was there. And at that time, Mapplethorpe was there for the opening and died shortly thereafter of AIDS. We signed up for it in 1988, and I remember my excitement about signing up for the show. Don't ever get too excited about, if any of you are in the museum world, don't get too excited about getting a show. But I remember seeing the Mapplethorpe show at the Whitney, and just thinking, like, this is a great show. And it's got everything going for it. These are interesting photographs, and all sorts of people are there, and they're talking, and they're discussing, and it's really great. And I wanted that show, and I remember that Janet Carden had organized a similar show, and I called her up and I said, could I take it? And she said, of course you could. Houston just dropped out. I should have had a clue from that, but I was too young and naive and excited. The big moment in this controversy before it came to Cincinnati happened in Washington. Two big moments. One is that Jesse Helms, who was then senator from the great state of North Carolina, and had made a career, a career as a racist, a career as a communist baiter. I mean, he's got a long history, but was in the Senate for many, many, many years, turned his attention to the National Endowment for the Arts. And there are all sorts of theories as to why. I think part of it had to do with kind of the collapse of the Soviet world and communism. He had to have something to pick on. And the NEA was a good choice because, in truth, we are always naive in this world. We fund things. We don't think about the consequences. And in those days, the NEA managed to put $30,000 into the catalog for the Robert Mapplethorpe exhibition. And on the floor of the Senate, Jesse denounced this exhibition as being immoral, as promoting homosexuality, as promoting love between the races. I remember that. It was great. But I mean, a serious diatribe on the floor of the Senate. With that happening, the Corcoran Gallery in Washington, one of our great old institutions, fearing the political repercussions of showing this exhibition, decided to drop the exhibition from its calendar. And it was a bombshell. It was truly an amazing bombshell for the art world. I heard about this at a meeting of art museum directors in Providence, Rhode Island. There was an annual meeting. And John Walsh, who was then head of the Getty Museum, walked in that meeting, and we were all sort of assembled there and having a good time. And he said, I have terrible news to tell all of you. He said, the Corcoran has decided not to show the Robert Mapplethorpe exhibition for fear of the political consequences of exhibiting this work. Think about that. And there was just a hush in the whole auditorium. And a friend of mine next to me from La Jolla said, do you know anybody who's taking that exhibition? And I said, yeah, I am. And he said, this is a quote, you're f***ed. And those are the moments that pass between museum directors. And I think I was. But it's interesting because it was a terrible moment. I mean, gut-wrenching moment. And I knew that I could not do what the Corcoran had done. I knew right then and there and that I would have to tell my board about what the situation was and what the potential was for our institution and for me personally and for the city. And just to let you know, the exhibition was eventually shown in Washington at the WPA, something I can't think what the initials mean, but somebody will remember. And an alternative space was shown. There were lots of artist protests. The funding dried up at the Corcoran. Half the board resigned. It was a terrible, terrible time for that institution. The director resigned. It was a bad time. The exhibition went on to Hartford, Connecticut, where, I kid you not, there were two grandmotherly types protesting and two males kissing at the opening to kind of denote what was going on. And then, of course, it went on to the Berkeley Museum, where the director received a medal from the community, this is so Berkeley, it's so Ann Arbor, but the director receives a medal, and I thought, well, maybe things won't be so bad after all. All right, so now I'm going to cue up the first videotape, and before we do it, Michael, as I said, I couldn't find my slides, but I wanted to show you a moment from the motion picture. There was a film done on this in the year 2000 called Dirty Pictures, and I am played by James Woods, no relation. I don't know how we got there, but Jimmy plays me. And there's a scene here that I'm going to show you that's 2 minutes long, in which Dennis Barrie / James Woods shows the pictures for the first time to his board.
These are our company's credit cards. Hundreds of them. They're cutting them up and canceling our accounts.
Well, maybe you should have created a better grade of merchandise, Hutch.
My people are all over me. I'm on the board. Why did I let this thing get out of hands? That joke wasn't funny.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to have called you on such short notice. Thank you for coming. Please, won't you all come in? Thank you. There's just a little heads up. I may have underestimated the reaction that some people have to these pictures, and we don't want a replay of what happened at the Corcoran.
What happened at the Corcoran?
Well, they canceled the show, and
They were pilloried by the art world, thrashed by the media, and the museum director lost his job. I guess Dennis doesn't want a replay of that.
Look, Sheriff Lease has not filed charges, and it's an election year. I think he's just trying to spook us. Okay, so these are some of the images that they're mainly concerned about. What Robert Mapplethorpe referred to as the X, Y, and Z portfolios. You'll see, these S&M pictures here.
Can't we just leave those out? Wouldn't that solve the problem?
No, that would violate our contract with the Philadelphia ICA, and I wouldn't do it anyway. You don't alter another curator's show. See, what Mapplethorpe created here was oftentimes multiple images, diptychs or triptychs. For example, if we were to take Man in Polyester Suit, yes? On its own, it obviously has a certain impact, but let's say that we take it with Calla Lily, yes? And you put them together, now all of a sudden there's a kind of harmony between the two pictures. They resonate one to the other. There's a whole that is greater than the sum of its rather substantial parts, if you will.
So, What are you asking us to do, Dennis?
Well, the lawyers want us to sue Sheriff Lease. That way he is compelled to prove that these are pornographic pictures by a legal standard, and he won't be able to do that, of course. We should then have our legal problems behind us, and we can proceed with the show.
Mr. 10.5. Christ. I don't want to sue the sheriff. I don't think this board wants to rush into anything. Dennis, this is your show. Why don't you just see if you can come up with a little agreement with Money Law? He'll talk to the sheriff. God knows he paid enough for him.
You know, I like that scene. First of all, that board was way better dressed than my board. Can we have the lights up, please? But that scene is actually somewhat accurate. And in a minute, I'll show you some of the Mapplethorpe images that I could not find from my slides. We actually, like most museums, had an exhibition committee. And the committee was comprised of people who liked contemporary art or who knew contemporary art, collected, whatever, a couple of artists, and then members of the staff. And we had reviewed the Mapplethorpe show before we agreed to present it to the board as among the shows we were going to present for that season, which was the year 1990. And the committee was excited about it. But it was interesting. In the wake of what happened at the Corcoran, I felt that all the board members should see the photographs, all of them, their entirety. And some of the board, again, that's a kind of slick-looking board there. Boards are made up of all sorts of people, and I have to say I spent half of that session explaining what they were doing in the photographs, as if I was some kind of expert, which I wasn't. But I mean, it was a very telling moment, and it's a very telling moment about boards and about what they go through. I mean, they're people. They're part of the community. Some of them know art, or some of them know what the museum does. Some of them are lawyers, some of them are accountants, some of them are housewives, some of them are housemen. I mean, they're just what they are. And then they're confronted with something that is outside the scope of their world. Okay? And these photographs, as they started to see them in their entirety, and as they started to hear about the controversy, their world turned upside down. So I'm going to show you, just because I want you to see the images, because we don't have any way of showing them, I'm going to quickly show you two segments that have the images.
This moment I'm hiding my face. Photos of objects, pictures of men. They're in positions that I've never been. Whole town is fighting about whether they're gross. I'd like to know how.
Mapplethorpe was mostly known for his nude studies, his flowers, and his portraits. It's Bill T. Jones. You can recognize half the figures in here. Deborah Harry, one of his many models. Again, one of his many models. Beautiful work. The flowers were probably the sexiest thing in there. Kind of a who's who of that era. Show you. There were 175 images in this exhibition, most of which you just saw there. It was interesting when we did the film for Showtime. Originally, the film was going to be made by HBO in 1990, and the producer, Michael Mannheim, would not do the movie unless all the images were shown on television. And HBO at that time could not take the risk of showing the work on television. This is 1990. 10 years later, Showtime made the film, and every image that was in the exhibition was shown, including the 6 or so that we were indicted for. There were 6 images, and Mapplethorpe, 4 of them showed S&M homosexual practices. And were very provocative. I wish I could cue them up, but maybe we can find them later if anybody wants to see them. Very provocative for their time. It was called the X Portfolio, and there's no doubt that the fact that there was open graphic sex, okay, between males was the point that really brought this controversy to a head, both in Congress and ultimately in Washington and Cincinnati. And then there were two photographs of children. Two young children that were photographed nude and semi-nude, who were close members of, were members of families close to Mapplethorpe. And I defy you to find the sexual content, but the prosecution of the center and the groups opposed to it found filthy content in those two images. So out of 175 images, we were prosecuted for 6. Can we have the lights all the way up because they're right in my eyes? And it's interesting to look at how we dealt with this. Let me go back and say that when we found out about the controversy, I did show the work to my board. The board did agree to go forward with this exhibition. They agreed unanimously. But in the months that came, board members were personally confronted, whether they were at a club, at a restaurant, playing golf. They were confronted about the fact that this exhibition, which was now gaining national attention, was bringing pornography to Cincinnati, and especially child pornography. And as the months wore on, the board became frightened. And we had to take another vote among the board members to go ahead with the exhibition. But we agreed that the only way we could go ahead was as we educated the community. We did an all-out campaign to tell the community what we were going to do, why this artist was important, why the work was important, what its context was, and not to believe all the myths about it. And I will say this, as a museum, we did a great job. I know in the end we got indicted, and I almost went to jail, but we did do a fabulous job. Both board members and volunteers and the staff worked the whole community, from politicians to clergy to special interest groups to religious groups of all kinds. We brought them in, we showed them the photographs, we showed the editorial boards of the newspapers, what the photographs would be. But so by the end of 1989, a few months before we were going to present the show in early 1990, the Cincinnati Enquirer ran a headline, editorial saying, "Cincinnati can handle the Mapplethorpe show." Okay, that was a headline. And the mayor of Cincinnati came up to me at a holiday party and said, "You know, Dennis, I think we can handle that homoerotic stuff." And I thought our mayor knows the word homoerotic. I was so floored, I couldn't believe it. But the city seemed to be very comfortable. And that's where the culture wars of that time really kicked in. Because in early 1990, the show was to open in April. In early 1990, certain organizations, mostly comprised of the Christian right, organized against us in an amazing, well-coordinated, well-financed, to the tune of ultimately $1 million, a campaign against this exhibition. And sent mass mailings out to the citizens of Cincinnati, had television shows, op-ed pieces, and basically created mayhem within the art community, the arts and cultural community, to the point at which ultimately it was decided, in Cincinnati there's a United Arts Fund. And that United Arts Fund funds the opera, the ballet, the symphony, the art museum, the Taft Museum, and the Contemporary Arts Center. And ultimately decided that we were such a liability that they were cutting off our funding, that they could not have us, because all of the other organizations, think about this, all the other museums and ballets and so forth in the city would go down for lack of funding, because of what these organizations were able to do in presenting the propaganda against this exhibition. So we had to withdraw from our funding source. And you do that and you're a small institution. We were a very small institution. I think at that time we had a budget of a little over $1 million. And when half of it goes away, you don't know whether you're going to stay open. And this is no exaggeration. So that was a critical moment. But we thought, quite honestly, that we could still win this battle. There was lots of national media, lots of attention. All of the First Amendment lawyers in the country, including those that would probably that were politically conservative and those that were liberally left, said that there was nothing obscene about this material, that a museum had the right to present this material, that it was constitutionally protected. And there was no case against us, and so that we could go on with this exhibition. And until the day we opened, I think we actually believed that we would get away with having this exhibition in Cincinnati. So April 6th, we opened to 4,500 people who stood in a freak snowstorm to see this exhibition. It was interesting, the day before, the Cincinnati Post ran an article basically saying that more Cincinnatians knew the name of Robert Mapplethorpe than the current president of the United States, because it had gained that much attention, that much momentum, that much controversy in the community. And Michael, do you have the last tape? I'm going to show you a little bit of this tape.
This whole ordeal has changed his life.
And I see myself personally much more committed to fighting for the political causes, whether it's the First Amendment or other causes that I believe in.
You're hearing from the new Dennis Barrie. Fresh from last week's victory, the art versus obscenity trial, Barrie says he will now travel the country arguing for First Amendment rights and for artistic freedom. Things Barrie says too few museum directors are concerned about.
It's very sad how unaware most of the people in my profession are of the political process and being involved in that political process. And I think now we realize, because of what's happened in Washington, what's happened in Cincinnati, what just happened in Broward County in Florida, that we're in a real struggle. And I'm glad I was lulled out of my complacency, which a lot of people in my generation are. I think a lot of people in my generation are.
Perhaps the single event that changed Dennis Barrie forever happened April 7th. That's the day Robert Mapplethorpe, the Perfect Moment exhibit, opened at the Art Center to the general public. The police, doing something that's never been done before, entered the museum to notify Barrie he had been indicted by a grand jury. We replayed those difficult moments for Barrie and asked him to comment on the police action.
Please leave the premises.
I'll have a statement in a little while.
A lot of things went through my mind. Everything from fear to concern for what was going on to a sense of outrage. There was the outrage when they actually came in because they had violated a museum, and I had never seen that happen, at least in our nation. And having been a part of this profession for 20 years, to see something like that occur is just one of the worst things you can possibly imagine. It's akin to some other time and some other place.
When you paused at the top of those stairs with Roger Ock, you walked out there, you looked like you came close to being right on the edge at one time. Hands over your face, what were you doing? What were you thinking?
I think the whole scene got to me. That sense of violation was so strongly a part of my mind at the moment. And at the same time, the fact that the people were out there and they recognized the violation and they were standing there supportively. And yes, I thought I would lose it there for a moment, but somehow you get it back together.
So be patient, be calm. I know how you feel.
Was this the lowest point in the whole battle?
Yes, this was the lowest point in the whole battle.
If April 7th was the lowest point in the battle, last Friday was the highest. That's when a jury of 8 Hamilton County residents acquitted Barrie in the Art Center of obscenity charges. As he watched the replay of that special moment, tears welled up in his eyes.
We, the jury in this case, being duly impaneled and sworn, do find the defendant not guilty of pandering obscenity.
It wasn't just a victory for me or for the Contemporary Arts Center. It was truly a victory for the city. The city in one moment redeemed itself from 8 months of darkness. Most Cincinnatians recognize that they too believe in these same values, and that day the values were upheld.
Now that Cincinnati's latest obscenity fight is over, it's appropriate to ask if the battle changed the arts in Queen City.
I think as a whole, this was not good for the arts in Cincinnati because it showed some of the division. The art world did not respond in a unified way.
Barrie's talking about the lack of support he got from two major arts institutions in town. While nationally known museum directors made a special trip to Cincinnati last April to pledge their institution's support for Barrie and the Art Center, leaders of the Taft Museum and the Cincinnati Art Museum would only pledge their personal support, not institutional support.
To answer your question, the Cincinnati Art Museum...
I think it was difficult for us to hear that local institutions would not take a public stand at a time when we did have support from every museum in the country, practically. And I think it was a mistake on their part. I think it's going to hurt them in the long run, sadly. I don't have any animosity toward those institutions particularly. I understand fear. I understand intimidation. I understand that even some of those places may have thought we were on the side of wrong. But in the end, you must stand up for the principle. And if your institution or organization doesn't do it, eventually they'll get you. Eventually they'll hang you because they've hung us. And that, I couldn't understand why they didn't see the real issue at stake here. Their own freedom was at stake.
Thank you. Thank you. That's hard to watch for a number of reasons. A, I was much skinnier. But also, it is hard to watch. You know, it brings back a lot of memories, and watching that last night was very difficult because it shows the volatility. It's interesting to think about museums as volatile places. You know, we're not, in our world, we tend to think of them not as necessarily quiet experiences, but to see all that passion and to see, you know, armed police and to see people protesting. There were, at that day, our capacity was 1,500 people, and there were 1,500 people out there milling, and it got very dangerous for a while, and to see the kind of the city redeem itself, but also what's hardest for me, not just that scene of the police coming in, which is the worst part, but what's hardest for me is the lack of I don't know, brotherhood, I won't say brotherhood, but of standing together on these issues within the cultural communities of our country. It was true. What was said in the clip there, you know, I had to go outside the city to get support for this controversy. And museum directors came from, you name the place, all over the country to be there because they knew what battle was taking place. If we lost in Cincinnati, you lost everywhere. You lost whatever you were going to do in the future was on the line. And so they were all there, but there was so much intimidation within the community that the directors who were pictured there, and they're both friends, but the directors who could not guarantee or could not give the actual support of their institution. And I thought, is this so short-sighted? Is this so dangerous? Does this show the divisiveness and the lack of you know, a united front in a battle that is absolutely huge? And indeed, they couldn't do it, and it was a sad moment. Now, we were acquitted, and that's the good moment. And that's actually a brilliant and wonderful moment because those jurors, and I haven't talked about them much in a long time, but those jurors know, what do I want to say, a scam when they see one. It was so fascinating in that trial, which lasted for about 10 days. And we were talking earlier at dinner about the experts who testified and didn't testify, and some of them did art speak, and that was kind of strange. And others did some other kind of speak that I didn't understand. But what came out of that trial was the fact that those jurors were not going to let various civil authorities decide for them what they were going to view. It was a very strong statement, and these were not, to a person, these were not museum goers. Okay, to a person, they were people who didn't go to the ballet, didn't go to the symphony. They lived out in exurbia for the most part, the outer reaches of Hamilton County, and yet they understood what was at stake, and and they all, to a person, they came back to see the Contemporary Arts Center. They were not allowed to go there or look at it by the judge. I'll put it that way. They were limited in what they could see. And so they came back later to see what they couldn't see, which I think was a big and wonderful statement. So that's what I take out of that that was the good thing, that people can decide and they can see what is right in terms of an ability for an organization or an institution to talk about a subject. That's the good thing that came out of Mapplethorpe. And for a while, I think there was a crest of exhilaration about what happened there. There certainly was exhilaration within the community in Cincinnati and probably within a lot of arts organizations and museums around the country for a short time. But in the long run, I'm sort of more cynical about what the effects were of Mapplethorpe and the battle for cultural supremacy in the early 1990s. You know, one of the victims was the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts. Prior to Mapplethorpe, the National Endowment for the Arts was a much more vigorous, much more risk-taking organization. And as a result of Mapplethorpe, it was pretty much emasculated. It didn't give grants to individual artists. I mean, all those kinds, any kind of risk-taking exhibition was off the docket. It became, the biggest funding went to the mainstream organizations. So you wouldn't get an alternative space getting big bucks. You would get you get the Detroit Institute of Arts instead of an alternative space in Detroit getting the money, because they knew that, you know, a Monet show wasn't going to rock anybody's, you know, sensitivities. Okay, and there's nothing wrong with Monet, but that kind of show was not going to rock the boat. But some show that dealt with the politics of whatever, you know, of race or society or whatever, would rock the boat. So the NEA was a victim in that sense. I think other museums in the wake of Mapplethorpe became extremely more cautious. There was this little phrase that went around that nobody wanted to be Dennis Barrie. And even I didn't want to be Dennis Barrie, but I mean, because no one wanted to go through that again. Okay, I mean, that was 2 years of my life, 2 years of my staff's life, my family's life, of the board, of the people in that community divided. People lost their jobs, people lost their marriages. I mean, there was that kind of consequence in the actions that took place there. So everybody, why should I do that? Why should I stick my head out with an exhibition that somebody will find offensive? So you really see in the 90s, just go back through the literature, you really see a kind of taming of the museum scene in the 1990s. And it's only once in a while that something, you know, blurts out, like the Sensations show in Brooklyn. Remember that Rudy Giuliani was threatened to shut off the funding for the Sensation show. So every once in a while, something like that happened. But it's a very rare moment. And it's a very rare moment when you read about anything even today as being controversial in the museum scene. If it's controversial, it tends to be about something that, quite honestly, the cultural warriors don't even care about. It'll be something PC. It might be about the Enola Gay, which was a very controversial exhibition at the Smithsonian and had to be rewritten. The content had to be written because of what it stated about the Japanese and the Americans in World War II. I mean, there were little things like that where museums became more correct so that they wouldn't get in trouble. And that I find that very difficult. I personally, for my own consequences, I was fired about a year after this happened. I think, and I don't blame my board. I understand why they fired me. They fired me because they wanted to get back to life as it once was. You know, boards and institutions and organizations really don't want a lot of things to shake things up. They want it to work as it's always worked. They want to be beloved. They want people to shake their hands when they're walking down the street and not cross the other side. And there was a real need to forget Mapplethorpe and for the members of the community. And I knew it. I mean, I knew that I had to move on. And I made a personal vow, although I didn't keep it, that I would never work for an institution that had any kind of public funding or board situation again. I wound up doing the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but had 2 boards and about $50 million worth of public funding, and a mayor who wasn't too much fun. But basically, it was one of those things where you thought you don't want to be that vulnerable again. And I think how many museum directors, how many curators had that same point of view? I can think about the people who left to go into private practice, who left to go to become dealers, who left to become private curators. I'm thinking about art world people now, rather than be in the kind of public forum where they were subjected to the whims and the agendas of all sorts of forces. So I say all that, and now, just to kind of winding up on all this, I want to talk about now a little bit more. You know, it's an interesting time for museums. Saying all these things that have happened, I'm still a total believer in what they do or what they can do and how they can do it. And we recently did the Spy Museum, which is a great success on critical and financial levels. But half the reason we did it was to show that there was some other model for doing museums. This one was a for-profit, privately funded museum that is very credible. I didn't think that could happen for all museums, but I thought there were other ways of looking for funding that were less vulnerable with, again, the politics of our nation. And it's been interesting to see the changes in museum programming and approaches. There are great things going on. I mean, exhibitions are becoming more lively in their presentation. They're willing to use AV. They're willing to try all sorts of things to create a kind of atmospheric approach, to tell you more about what's going on with the exhibits. There used to be a time when you walked into an art exhibition where they just hung the stuff on the wall, and it was up to you to find out who the artist was and what he or she was trying to express. Now, that's great if you have all the time in our society to do that. Most of us don't. And so they've taken those steps in presentation to be more welcoming to the public and be a little more daring in the way they present. But I don't think they've been more daring in content. And I defy you to go around the country and look at anything that really shakes you up, outside of some little alternative gallery that's not getting any money and nobody's seeing it anyway. And so that most of the stuff, and even they back off. I mean, evolution is a hot button. One of the things we might have talked about in this symposium. Evolution is a hot button where exhibits on evolution now are so controversial that natural history and science museums walk away from evolution. What will it be next? So I really think it's time for the people who are in this business to be true to their missions, to be true to what museums are all about. They are forums for discussion. They are forums for ideas. They're the best because, you know what, it's great to sit home at television and see some of these things discussed, but when you're in a museum, you're in a public place and you're interacting with other people and you're seeing their reactions, and you can have a negative or a positive, but you're there in a highly, what can be a highly energetic space for the discussion of ideas. And if we don't discuss them there, they're relegated to television and to other forms. And I think that's part of our mission, and we're failing to do it. So I was trying to find a quote, and I asked my wife, Kathy, I couldn't remember it. But of all places, the CIA, okay, which we worked with a lot when we were doing the Spy Museum, who, by the way, followed the Mapplethorpe exhibition very closely, which I just love. I thought, oh my God. I'll tell you just a little anecdote. When we were in the first time we went to the CIA to get some information about the Spy Museum, we were getting a tour, and I'm on an elevator with two of the agents, and they said, well, we really liked what you did in Cincinnati. I was just in a state of shock, you know, because I thought, oh my God, if they know I did the Mapplethorpe show, I'll never be seen again, you know, this is the CIA. But it turned out that they were a very enlightened group of people, and they were very interested in what happened there. But when you walk in the CIA, there is a motto on the wall that says, the truth shall set you free. And I thought about that tonight in this lecture, about what truth is in museums and in what their goals are and what their missions are. It is about truth. It may be one version of the truth, it may be a curator's version of the truth, a director's or whatever, but it is out there for discussion, for analyzing, and for just bringing up an idea to be looked at. And so I think it's so much a part, the legacy of Mapplethorpe, the legacy of what we're doing today is to get back, do it wonderfully, use all the gadgets, use all the great new things that museums can do today, all the educational techniques, but tell the story and tell it honestly. And don't be afraid that some group's going to pick at you, or some group's going to demand you be closed, or some group's going to end your funding here from some foundation that probably wasn't going to fund you anyway. I know that's sort of easy to say when I'm not on the front line anymore because I work in the private sector, but I think it's critical. And I was on the front line, and I would do it again, and I ask you all to think about doing it now. So with that, I thank you. Thank you. We have time for Q&A. I'll take some questions. Yes.
In Cincinnati, were the groups and people opposing the exhibit, were they from within Cincinnati? I know nowadays we have sort of roving groups of interested citizens who go around and protest things. Was that the case there?
Both. The Citizens for Decent Literature and Citizens for Community Values were groups that were organized in Cincinnati actually before this controversy and were well funded through a couple of individuals, okay, who play on a national level. But then there were other groups, the Reverend Donald Wildman, who you don't even hear about anymore, and others that were Pat Robertson. There were others who kind of came in from afar to do some of the organization, and funding sources were the funding, which was huge for the opposition, including the trial, came from a lot of national sources, but actually much of it from a Cincinnati billionaire who, this is his particular cause. Other questions? Yes?
Yeah, was the prosecutor an elected official, and whatever happened to the prosecutor after all this?
Is that the Supreme Court? No. He was, the prosecutor, yes, was an elected official. Okay, I mean, I shouldn't take the bad. Yes, Arthur Ney, who was the prosecutor, was an elected official. He's just since retired. It's interesting that nothing much happened to his career as a result of it. It's interesting that one of the biggest instigators of the whole activity of the actions against us was the sheriff of Cincinnati, Simon Lease. And Simon is he has the longest running political office, holding office for the longest time of any official in Hamilton County. He is still sheriff. And he was great because long before I got there, he had closed down Calcutta and Hare and something else. And, he was classic. I mean, he was a classic one of those guys. But I think he may still be in office. So there wasn't any political fallout in that way. The political officials who were there are still there. I think the fallout was on there was a lot of corporate warfare, okay, intense corporate warfare over board members who belonged to certain corporations and corporations who opposed the exhibition. And it was there that people lost their jobs. Okay, that at least 3 members of the board lost their jobs as a result of activity against them. So there were real consequences. Yes?
I know this must be really hard to gauge, but what did you feel the institution's relationship to the wider community was before the whole controversy happened, and how did it change after?
Yeah, that's a good question. The Contemporary Arts Center was founded in 1938 by 3 women who had gone to Smith and who were kind of bothered about how provincial Cincinnati was. And, it was funny, when it was founded, it was called the Modern Art Society, like they all are, or they were in those days. And they would have their exhibitions in the basement of the art museum, and people would come to the exhibitions and not sign their real names in the book. They'd sign like Mr. and Mrs. Smith, it's like a bad motel. And because modern art or contemporary art was daring. Okay, this is in the 1930s. And then it grew, and it got lots of support, relatively lots of support. Old families, young artists, whatever, supported it. So by the time I came there, it had a beautiful building. great history of wonderful shows. Some of the first shows of people that today are household names, Jenny Holzer. You can go on down the list. I mean, of great, great people who showed at the center in either one of their first shows or among their first shows. I came there in '83. And what it didn't have was attendance. It really didn't. And so we spent a huge part of our time doing shows, but getting population through the doors. And we were doing about 100,000 people a year, which is pretty amazing for a contemporary arts center in a city that size. And we had lots of support, both individual and corporate, and lots of membership. When the controversy hit, our membership soared. Okay, I mean, we went from maybe 1,600 members to 4,500 members because people were taking a stand on the issue. And there were old families, young families, all sorts of people. It was interesting to see. And but the corporate support, of course, disappeared completely. And as I said, the funding from the Fine Arts Fund, the United Arts Fund of this community, dried up. So we had to go outside the community for funding, and we had to go to certain foundations. We went to the Ford Foundation, all sorts of, everybody from Barbra Streisand to Hugh Hefner to Nathan Cummings Foundation. A lot of different foundations funded us to stay alive and to fight the battle. When I left in '91, things were, I'd say, pretty bad, quite honestly, in terms of funding. But the crowds were coming back. Had never left. The crowds were still there. And eventually, to the credit of the staff and the board, they built back up their cachet and standing in the community, and were able to raise $38 million to build a beautiful building by Zaha Hadid. That's a major accomplishment. So I think now it enjoys a standing in the community. I think it is, it'll never be the most loved institution in Cincinnati because of the nature of what it shows and does. I mean, it doesn't show Monet, okay? And it doesn't show, King Tut. It shows some cutting-edge artist who's probably hard to understand. And so it's the nature of the beast. But I think it's a respected part of the community. Yes?
I'm sure that people weren't happy to lose their jobs, but what did they say about that, the board members?
What did they say about losing their job?
Yeah, I mean, the reaction, having been a part of it, and
yeah, I think. Well, it was so vicious, and it's not totally conveyed in. It's conveyed in the rest of that movie, but it was so vicious that these people. I mean, these were personal attacks on their life, including my own. But so it would be about their personal life. It would be about things that were terrible to say about anyone. And so in most cases, they both lost their jobs and resigned from the board, okay, because they couldn't, they were without portfolio, they were without standing in the community. And almost all of them recovered, okay? One left town, but two recovered pretty successfully. But one was the president of a bank, and he did not recover. Okay, so it had that kind of animosity. It was the fervor is hard to explain, but the fervor was really there, where people would be so divided against each other and not talk to each other again for 10 years or whatever it might be. Yes, I'm sorry, back there.
Hi, good evening. My name is Ted. I'm a designer and exhibit preparator living here in Ann Arbor. And just on a personal level, I kind of like to bend rules. I like to push envelopes a little bit, but I'm not interested in setting the rules on fire, if you will. And you're really interesting to talk to. You obviously like a little bit of shock value in your speeches. It's fascinating. I like it a lot. But is there any part of you, any little part in you somewhere that was interested in, how can I say it, assaulting any groups of people or established ideas or...
With this exhibition?
Yes.
I think with other exhibitions, that's a very good question. I think with other things, I'll tell you a little about rock and roll in a minute. With this exhibition, no. I actually just thought it was beautiful work. It was pretty well accepted in the art community at the time. It was, believe me, we had shown content that was much more graphic, okay, in terms of sexuality and in terms of violence and other things, like most contemporary art centers of that time. So I actually didn't think it was the most daring work in terms of content that we had ever presented. So no, I didn't think of it. I was probably a little naive. I think, thinking, it's here's everybody looking at it, loving this show, and the board loved it when they first saw it, and whatever, So I think I didn't see that as an assault per se. It's interesting that when we did the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I was determined that it wouldn't be wimpy, and that it wouldn't vanilla-ize, as I like to call it, rock and roll. And there were a number of members of the board who had a vision of rock and roll that was just bullshit, for lack of a better word. And it was just this kind of, I always call it the Happy Days version of rock and roll. Happy Days never existed. That's a TV show. I feel like Dan Quayle. But it's a TV show. It never existed. It was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Okay, and you better accept it. You better accept it right in your face, and that's why people were going to go to this museum. And so the staff and I really kind of did it. And we knew we would take some hits for it in terms of content, in terms of language, in terms of talking about all sorts of topics. We did, but I think the public really liked it. And that, I know, was, in a sense, purposeful. Not to make somebody angry, but to say we're not going to back off from what this has to be in that case. So the content was pretty, in some places, in your face. There was one over here, and then I'll take that one. Yeah.
Having gone through this issue firsthand in this battle, do you ever see this issue coming up again? And if not, perhaps a different issue, and what do you think the next issue might be?
Not this issue, what, the next issue?
Do you ever see this problem coming up again with what you said, art versus obscenity?
Yeah, I don't know about the sexuality issue. Certainly gay marriage truly remains the hot button. It decides elections. It certainly decided the presidential election because of the state of Ohio and what happened with the gay marriage initiative. I think that was a key part of it. So I think, were you to do a show on gay marriage or something like that, which has some kinship to Mapplethorpe's work, it could conceivably be a very controversial exhibit in some places. As I said, I think the issues tend to move on to these big social issues, these big social concerns. And whoever thought, and some of you are very young, but those of us who are less young, less young, you like that? Whoever thought that evolution would be a battle again. We're talking the Scopes trial in 1923, whatever year it was. Whoever thought that we would be arguing over evolution in the year 2006? So I don't know where it will come from. I do know that you can never you think you can guard against controversy, and you never can. Because even in the most benign exhibitions or topics, somebody can find controversy. We did a show at the Contemporary Art Center that was a Smithsonian show called Diamonds Are Forever. And it was about baseball, artists and writers on baseball. Come on, it's Mom, apple pie, and baseball. And it was done by the New York State Museum at Albany, and it was circulated by the Smithsonian. Pretty good moniker, it's the Smithsonian. And we had protesters over that show. We had protesters over the content of two of the paintings. We had protesters over one little sculpture which was called the Church of St. Babe Ruth. And it had Babe's life portrayed as the Stations of the Cross. And we had, I think it was great actually. And we had a film put together by the Smithsonian on fast clips about baseball in pop culture, doing everything from Who's on First with Abbott and Costello, to Billy Crystal, to whatever, to all those people who used to do the baseball shticks. And we had a protest because of two clips. One was from the film Peggy Sue Got Married, in which The two boys are talking. There are two boys and two teenage girls. The girls are sitting on the boys' laps. The boys are talking about baseball. The girls are talking about making out. And the second clip was from Play It Again, Sam, Woody Allen, in which he's in bed with Diane Keaton and he's using a baseball metaphor. And I just thought, oh my God, and we were picketed for that exhibition. So it's a Smithsonian show about baseball. Think about it. I don't know, so if you're planning something, let us know. There was one right here.
Well, two things I wanted to do. One was to tell you that if you get to stay in town another day, it would be wonderful. There's a show opening on State Street, put together by a school of art graduate students called If Other Please Explain. If Other Please Explain, which is a reference to designating your race or gender or sexual orientation.
I forgot about that. Yeah.
And I think it's going to be a pretty brave show, and it would be wonderful if you could come at the Work Gallery on State Street.
The Work Gallery?
Yes, and at the Institute, on the same street, Institute for Research on Women and Gender, Clarissa Sly has a show of photographs of transgender transformation.
See, you are the Republican then, aren't you?
Yeah. But then I wanted to ask you a question also. I noticed that when you talked about the two photographs that were controversial of children by Mapplethorpe, I know them well, that you mentioned, and he was a really good friend. They were
I did sort of,
And we have a friend in this area, a professor at Wayne State, who was the mother of a child, and the photographs. So that's not a protection in the sense, but close to the children.
No.
And I just wondered if you could tease apart some of the reactions that were to the sexual orientation of adults, and to and if the fact that they were together added to the controversy, or something about that, because this is a subject that is maybe not impacting museums so precisely, but it's still affecting very much the rights of women to photograph their world and their children. And
like that was the Sally Man, and That's a really good and a very difficult question, and because yes, I do think the fact that Mapplethorpe was a homosexual man, openly and flagrantly, in his lifestyle, that certainly colored whatever else was in that show. Okay, so even if so the photographs he often took photographs of children. I wish I could dig them out there, but one's a nude boy and the other one's a semi-nude girl. They're both like 4 years old or 5 years old. I brought it up because in both cases the parents had given permission, and that became a huge part of our case.
Well, even the children as adults have written and said.
Yes, they have. Jesse,
it was never a problem.
Right.
But I'm just wanting to point out that doesn't protect someone.
No, it doesn't protect
or his closeness or their permission.
The prosecution, and I can't think of Jesse's mother anymore. I can't think of Jesse's last name, the boy. They were going to, whatever the equivalent of, extradite her from London for the prosecution was to charge her with child abuse and sexual and children and endangerment, and I mean it was just outrageous. And there's an interesting clip, if you ever watch the Dirty Pictures movie, they do a lot of interviews with people from the period, from William F. Buckley to people who posed for Mapplethorpe, and among them is Susan Sarandon. And she talks about the fact that she posed for him, but she talks about the fact that he was almost prim and proper when he was around her children, and actually chastised her for being too loose in front of her children and not being married, which I thought was really kind of a funny, having the children out of wedlock. Yes, you can't, it isn't protected. And it becomes a big issue in our society, and it's sort of the eye of the beholder. The interesting thing, people would go looking for those two photos, and they would come and they just kind of shake their head as to what was the issue with those two photos of the children. And the jurors who I spoke to afterwards said they never thought the children were an issue. Okay, they never felt that they were. Yeah, that is an incendiary in our society, we all know, and we know why. I mean, there are lots of bad things that happen to children.
Michigan's own law about that exception for artistic, educational,
Yeah.
or medical, they took it away.
Did they? Well, you're in Ann Arbor, but there's also Lansing. I don't know how to answer it. One more or two more, I think we're just about done. Are we here?
How did you go from being the butt of a national joke, nobody wants to be Dennis Barrie, to being a successful museum
Smoke and mirrors. Well, you know, it was interesting. It didn't help me in Cincinnati, and I knew. I'll be frank. I knew I would never get another art museum job. And I was trained as an art historian and a historian, and because it was too volatile. And so the jobs that I would have thought I would have gotten, are, you know, in the museum world, there's a tendency to go kind of move along and go from one place to another. You hardly ever light in one place. And so, you know, I was going to kind of move to this museum and move to that museum. I had a career path all, you know, scoped out. I knew that was over. No one would hire me in that world. And so I did some consulting, and there were some interesting and provocative clients. Everything from a program out in Santa Fe called Site Santa Fe to the Elvis Presley estate. I mean, I worked with whoever I wanted to work with, knowing that I probably wouldn't get jobs for things I was trained for. And I made the joke once that I would never work for another museum unless it was the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I swear to you, I told this joke to a reporter, and about a month later, I got a call from the headhunter for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame if I was interested, and I thought he was joking. But it was interesting that the Mapplethorpe stance in the music world helped me a great deal, okay, because the freedom of expression in music has always been, and will continue to be, a huge issue. Lyric content. And so that led to that job. That job just led to a bunch of others. And mostly, it's interesting, rarely will we work with an art museum. Not that I don't love art, I love it. But it's almost always, we did the Spy Museum, we're working on 5 or 6 different projects now there. Everything from, we are doing another music project, doing the Grammy Awards project. We're doing a project for the city of Las Vegas, which focuses a great deal on the history of the mob and its impact on Las Vegas. Great stories. And we're working with a Freshwater Institute and a science center. We're doing, they're all very varied jobs. We're doing work for the Academy Awards. I love movies, so we're doing a kind of history of film for them. And I think it was just, kind of not giving up after that and looking for where the talents that I have and my interests would be usable, knowing that my old talents were no longer usable, that I wouldn't get an art museum job. So, and I don't, every once in a while I regret it, thinking, oh, the Met, it could be mine. But the truth is, I don't regret it. I really, nobody can plan out their career, and it's kind of interesting what ultimately happens, and you kind of go from one place to another. I've liked most of the things we've done, and they're pretty interesting jobs, pretty interesting subjects, pretty interesting people. And so that's it. One more, and then we'll quit.
I just want to say I appreciate your talking about the costs and consequences so openly. Because for museum, for you and for artists who fight these battles, right, the costs are horrendous. I mean, we lose relationships, money, and jobs and opportunities and exhibitions, all kinds of things. And people from afar often think, oh, well, it's some kind of career boost. Oh, what a joke. I mean,
it's very funny.
It's such...
You can say that again. It's a career boost, yes. That's a brilliant career boost.
Yeah, right. And it's just the opposite. opposite.
Yeah.
I mean, you become a pariah.
Yeah.
So
there were people who accused me of that. I just thought, oh, you must be out of your mind. I mean, how dumb was I to think this was a career move? It's not. Yeah. If you're thinking about it, it's not a good career move. You know, and some people transcend it. Some people, you know, and Andy Warhol is talented enough and crazy enough and whatever enough that, you know, got away with one, you know. But how many people don't? And you're right. It becomes you never think of it as a career move. Who said that dying was a great career move for him? I can't remember. I can't remember what it was, but it's not a good career move. So I think that's it. Anything else? If not, I think we're done.